So hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Wise Orange Conversations. Today, Kurt is joining me, and he is a writer, a blogger, and a coach. I don't know too much about him other than what I've seen on his website and on his Twitter feed. This is the first time we've connected, so I'll let him talk about himself, but we can go from here. So. Thanks for joining me, Kurt. It's a
Thank you for
pleasure
having
to
me.
have you. It's a pleasure to talk to somebody who is doing the type of work that you're doing and is motivated enough to put it out there. So with that, I just want to ask you. So can you just tell us a little bit about yourself? Whatever you think is interesting, or yeah, whatever you think is interesting. And if I have extra questions, I'll add my questions.
So, I developed the courage to start blogging about a year and a half ago. And
can I just interrupt you? Can you just tell us
yeah,
about where you're from, where were you born,
yep.
how old are you? Just like
So, I'm 39 years old, and I live in Sonoma County, which is the wine country of California, about 45 minutes north of San Francisco.
Mhm.
And I just recently had an epiphany of starting to blog because I have quite the story, and my journey has been a long way in the making,
Mhm.
and I think I'm just going to dive right into it so people understand what my passion is. It took a lot of courage for me to start blogging because I knew that I had a story, and I think that a lot of times we hear that saying when someone says, "You're not your past." And that never really sat well with me because I always felt that we get one life, and I didn't want a single part of my life to get missed. I didn't want resume of my life to be something about hiding a mistake. And I felt like in order for me to live my life to the fullest and express myself, I needed to put a highlight on everything and narrate it in a way that helps myself and others. So the first thing that I will mention is I experienced about 2.5 years of homelessness, and I'm a recovering methamphetamine addict. So I used for years, and I have about 9 years clean. And that struggle with addiction came from very early in life. I'm a gay
Like
man.
how early?
Oh, like when I was 20 years ago.
Okay. It was always meth?
Always meth.
Okay.
Always meth. I do think that psychologically or physiologically, certain people are drawn to different drugs because we are all different. There are people who respond to marijuana or a downer, and there are people who mentally want an upper.
Yeah.
And I was definitely someone who was drawn to methamphetamine or coke or an upper to get myself up. My challenge in life from the very beginning was a struggle with my self-worth and my identity. It started very early with the fact that I grew up in a very religious family. For example,
Have you always lived in California?
I'm sorry?
Have you always lived in California?
Always lived in California.
Okay.
But my grandfather was a missionary to Africa. And my family on that side was always very involved with the Christian church.
Okay.
And from a very early age, the very first thing that I was faced with was the issue of me recognizing that I was attracted to men and not women, and how that fit into a relationship with God. The reason that I start my explanation with that is because that really fed into a lack of self-confidence in myself and a
So
negative self-concept.
when did you sort of came to the conclusion or realization that you're gay?
Um, it's interesting when you're young, you don't have the vocabulary, right, to identify those words.
Yeah.
Um, I remember going to movies when I was younger with my family as early as 5 years old. And I remember if there was a scene that I as a kid was not supposed to see,
Mm-hmm.
I was definitely drawn to the undressed man and not the undressed woman.
Okay.
I wouldn't say that at that age I could identify that with words,
Yeah.
but I knew inside that I was different. And according to how I was raised, that difference I needed to hide.
Okay.
My mom passed away when I was 13. And I mention that because if there was one person who at that point in my life I felt I could have come out to at some point in the future, it would have been her.
Mm-hmm.
I remember laying in bed at night and praying to God that at the end of all of this, if I was wrong and if I couldn't be open and out about who I was, that he wouldn't send me to hell. And I remember one night falling asleep when I was about 14 years old, and I whispered to myself really quick, "Kurt, you're gay," and fell asleep.
Mm-hmm.
And that was my moment of coming out to myself. When I went through high school, I went to a private religious high school, and I was never picked on, and I had a lot of friends, but I was lonely. I was alone. And in every moment, I had to present myself as someone that I was not.
Do you think your friends knew, or did you think other people?
I think that some people knew. And I think that there are people in my life at that time who would have been okay with it. And I think there are other people who were grateful that I never came out, because I think it would have faced them with a conversation that they weren't ready to have.
Mm-hmm.
You know, my frustration sometimes with our relationship with God, or with how God was taught to me, is that we would avoid the conversations that really mattered. And I think that it was easier for sometimes for people to have faith if it was a faith that didn't question anything.
Yeah.
And for me, that always broke my heart, because I feel like a higher power, if it is truly a higher power, would say, go whatever path you want, because I'm so great that I will be at the end of any path you go down.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that in that conversation, if we're really going to live up to the greatness as human beings that we are, we're designed to question everything.
Mm-hmm.
And we're designed to find our own truth, if only we could give ourselves the courage to do so.
Mm-hmm.
So after that experience with high school, you know, if someone's listening,
I'm
yeah.
I'm gonna interrupt. Did you have any kind of romances or anything like that while you were in high school, or did you
I
like
had
boys?
crushes, but
Okay.
no, no
Okay.
romances.
So
You
you
know,
hadn't
it's,
come out yet. Like it was there was like a fear. Was there a fear
oh, very much so.
of
Very much
acting
so.
out your emotions?
I was so protected, in a family that was religious, and so protected from the world around me, that I'm actually shocked that I could grow up 45 minutes north of one of the most gay-friendly cities, San Francisco,
Yeah.
in the world, and not even know that there was a significant group of people, a significant percentage of the population that lived freely the way they wanted.
Yeah.
And it still amazes me that that possibility really didn't present itself to me until I was about 17 or 18 years of age.
Okay.
Um,
About San
and
Francisco being like a gay kind of a city, like, okay,
yes,
okay.
I mean, if there is a city in the United States that is and always was at the forefront of political influence for gay rights, San Francisco would be it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and you know, when you my experience of that of being in the States is a lot of times you grow up in a small town and you might be the only non heterosexual person, and you run the risk of thinking that your uniqueness or your ability or your gift is your homosexuality simply because you want to find the person in yourself that's different than everyone around you,
Mm-hmm.
and you identify with that as your unique thing.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is that then you go to a big city like San Francisco or Los Angeles,
Yeah.
and you suddenly realize that there are many, many people who are living freely as homosexuals, and all of a sudden you're in an identity crisis because you're no longer special. And you have to dig deep and realize that that was never the part that made you special. You just thought it was because, yes, you had to fight a fear, um, being alone in who you were.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that was that next step, that going to a big city and feeling as if I wasn't special, and feeling as if everything I thought that could make me unique in this life wasn't worth anything, is what then led me to addiction.
Mm.
When
Okay.
people ask what it's like,
So are you kind of saying that homosexuality was kind of your identity up
yes,
to a certain point,
yep,
and then and then if a lot of other people around you were also gay, then it meant that you don't know who you are, because
yes,
what's so
yep,
different about, like, who am I?
yeah,
They're gay, I'm gay, so what's the difference?
exactly,
Okay.
exactly.
Okay.
Um, and I think that we as people, we want to find what makes us special, right? And we
Mhm.
want to know that we have something unique to bring, because life's difficult. It's worth it, but it's difficult, and we cling to our or try to find our purpose, because otherwise, what's the point?
Exactly.
Um, so I started doing methamphetamine. It was introduced to me at a party, um, and you know, when you listen to someone who shares a story of using drugs, um, I whether people are willing to listen to it or not, I compare it to what someone is looking for in religion. Um, you know, when someone does drugs, or they're seeking an alternative state of mind because they don't know how to sit with themselves and be okay with themselves.
Mm.
And when you ask what someone is looking for when they do drugs, and when you ask what someone is looking for when they are sitting in church, the answer is the same. You are looking for peace, and ultimately you are looking for peace with yourself. Um, and
I'm sure a lot of religious people are gonna challenge you on that, because like you're telling me going to church is the same as shooting up. But okay, but I can see your perspective of of,
um,
of wanting
yeah,
to be at peace, and that's why you go to you wanna feel. I guess, do you think that religion, as well as drugs in general. I mean, I guess different drugs are different, but let's say meth. Uh, were you yearning for connection, or for a sense, or was it more a sense of less anxiety? or both?
It's both. I think there are some, I can't quote the articles, but there are some very interesting articles that talk about the link between anxiety and self-esteem.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, I absolutely wanted a connection. I can't tell you that at age 20, I would have been able to verbally say, I want a connection.
Yeah.
You know, a part of this realization is looking back. It's in retrospect. It's not in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, I was absolutely looking for a connection.
Okay.
I think the other conflict for me was I have an older brother and sister that were very open and very loving and very much against how we were raised. So when they went to college, it was almost like an emotional choice of defiance to decide that there was no God. That was just their instant decision.
Mm-hmm.
And for me,
So
I always,
can I interrupt you here? What is
yeah.
it about growing up in a religious family that turned you and your siblings off to religion? What was it? What's so heavy about it?
So on a side subject, that's why I think that in the United States, religion is such a touchy subject. For me, depending on who's asking me what I believe, I might answer that I am religious, or
Yeah.
I might answer that I am spiritual in my belief.
Mm-hmm.
Because I believe in God or a higher power. But for many of us, including my brother and sister and I, raised in the Christian church, it's tricky. You're taught that God created us, and yet the image of God that you're taught to believe in, if you think about it, is completely opposite. Because the image of God that's projected on you is the image of God that human beings decided to create in their own minds.
Mm-hmm.
So when you read the Bible and when you look at stories that happened at that time, you know, oftentimes the verses that are selected from the text are used to win an argument. And a lot of times I think there's a conflict with what faith can be. I think that a lot of times you will hear someone say that faith is blind, that you're supposed to have blind faith. And I think that faith is visionary. I
Mm-hmm.
think that faith is holding on to an ideal and a value that you hold true for yourself. And the story that I go to is when, in the Bible, when Moses comes down from the mount, he goes and sees the Israelites, and he has had his time with God on the mount. And the Bible mentions fornication, it mentions all of those things that the Israelites were doing. But the one thing that speaks out, that speaks to me the most, and the thing that I felt Moses was most upset about, was the fact that they had chosen to represent God in an idol, like a false God.
Mm-hmm.
For me, the thing that we as human beings in a physical form have a really difficult time understanding is that what God was saying was that God is so big and so powerful, as the Bible says, God is love. And if you think about love, it's very difficult to define love because the most powerful things in life can't be defined. So someone can kiss someone and it can be an act of love. Someone can hug someone can say kind words, but those are all acts of love. In truth, love is everything, and it's so big and so powerful that its power remains intangible, because the second that you try to define something is in truth the second that you limit it. So in that moment when Moses comes down from the mountain, it's my interpretation that the true anger comes from the fact that God's saying, I am so big and so great because I am love, that you are limiting me and yourself by trying to encapsulate me into a physical image. And that's really hard for all of us, because we're physical beings and we desperately want to put everything into a physical, tangible form so that we can measure it, define it, and file it away in our heads.
Yeah, so I'm gonna jump in and tell you a little bit about my take on this. Um, I think I absolutely agree with you. I think I didn't grow up in a particularly religious home. Um, I'm Iranian, and my parents are Muslim, and I consider myself to be a Muslim. I'm not, I guess, practicing in the sense that most, if you asked a Muslim clergy, would be, I wouldn't be a practicing Muslim, but nonetheless, I think um, I don't like that definition of practicing. I think the definition of practicing that I like is, I think I would consider myself an a person who aspires to be. I think all religions essentially are about being good people, good human beings, and that's the output of it. But I think the psyche and the thought process behind it is really what your intent is. I think your intentions are really what matter. And um, I came kind of to this sort of spirituality and this kind of stuff after going through a hard period in my life, and um, sort of thinking about who I am and what I am. I got involved into Buddhism and spirituality to some extent.
Yep.
And, you know, you're saying, God is love. I think what that means to me is love doesn't discriminate.
Yep.
If you are love, you love everything. You even, and the second you start to not love something, you are no longer love. You'll be, I think the definition, to me, for me at least, of the devil is the one that cannot love
Yep.
everything. And it will get to a point. So the devil is like, no, that's it'll be like, don't go there or don't do that. And at some point it will discriminate against itself.
Yeah.
Right. So I think
Yep.
if you go down the path of evil, right, and not love, I don't want to call it evil, I call it non-love. If you go down the path of non-love, you start discriminating against certain things. Certain things become bad, and then once you're done with that, certain other things become bad, and so on and so forth. So that's sort of how I see it, and I think.
No, I agree. I think that the part that's really difficult for example, my sister and myself, or many of us that were raised Protestant or Christian in the United States, is there is so much fear, and a lot of times,
Fear of God?
yes, but also fear of the unknown, as if anything that is unknown to you, anything that is unfamiliar, is a threat. And it's hard to witness, because you will see people be fearful, and because it's a threat to them, they will say it's a threat to their faith. And it's really hard when you watch someone take it to the next step and say, well, then if it's something that I'm afraid of, it must be the devil's work and not God's work. And I think that that was part of my experience growing up in the church. Was oftentimes that was the switch that was made in someone's head with interpretation. Was anything that was unfamiliar, anything that didn't fit what they viewed as God, which essentially was a reflection of who they were as a person.
Yeah.
That it was a threat, and because it was a threat, it wasn't of God.
I see.
And even though in the United States it is not cool to say that someone questions someone of another color or ethnicity, I want it to go beyond that. I don't want someone to not say a racist comment because it isn't the norm anymore. I want someone, and I don't want someone to be okay with my homosexuality simply because it's not cool anymore to not be okay with it. There's still so much more that isn't talked about. There's still so much fear that is underlying, at least in the United States, that's just below the surface. Mm-hmm. Even though the laws of the United States have now put in writing the necessary framework, words are just words. Yeah. And a law is just a law. And we're not there yet.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with you. And I think I spent most of my 20s and early 30s in the Boston area. So, you know, I mean, Boston is also a pretty liberal city. Mm-hmm. But I can definitely get that. I think it takes a lot for people to sort of, I think it takes generations, you know, it takes generations, and it takes self-question. I feel like a lot of what people don't do, people like to be, they like reaffirmation that their way of doing things, their way of thinking, we all do, I do, you know, but I feel like it's also a good practice to question yourself and ask yourself sometimes, you know, what is it that, you know, is everything I believe today, is it, you know, the best things I could believe, or can I change my beliefs so that it would, you know, help me be a better person? And I think we rarely do that, you know. So I think it'll, you know, it'll take time, you know, people, I think for people to come to that kind of a realization, and I think there will always be a discrimination. I think there's forms of discrimination today that we don't have words for.
Yeah.
You know, like, and I think like discrimination based on class and money is a very widely accepted form of discrimination. It's just so normal. But I'm sure there will come a day where that won't be true. So I used to, before moving to the UK, I lived in Canada, and my parents lived in Boston. And I used to go back and forth through the border a lot, just crossing the border. And the border, the US border guards, they would ask me, they're like, you know, why are you going to Boston? And, you know, I'm Iranian. I'm a US citizen. I'm a US citizen, but I'm in my passport says born in Iran, right? So when I enter the country, they're like, oh, red flag, you know, who is this guy? So, but, and then they would start questioning me. It's like, what do you do? The first questions that they ask you is, what's your job? What do you, and if you tell them, let's say if you told them, I don't work, or if you tell them, I'm a poet, okay? Or if you told them, I'm a lawyer, those are all very big differences. So if you tell them, I don't work, or I'm a poet, they'll be like, what? Come on in, we want to talk to you some more. But if you told them I'm a lawyer, they'd be totally cool with that. And that to me is a big form of discrimination. That exists so vividly, and so it's so rampant. There's lots of it, and we don't talk about that. But anyways, I don't want to get too much into that. So let's sort of go back to your life story. So you were telling me, okay, so you're now in your, you know, late teens, early 20s, and you were talking about how you felt like you didn't have an identity anymore because did you move to San Francisco? Is that what happened?
After I mentioned San Francisco, but actually right after high school, I moved to Los Angeles.
Okay.
And I lived in Los Angeles for 10 years, give or take. And, you know, I very early on when I was living in LA, I got introduced to methamphetamine. You know, methamphetamine is pervasive in so many places now, but it was very pervasive and is very prominent in the gay community.
Yeah.
And it's easy to find. It's everywhere in that community, and we all partook of it, and you know, it led to unsafe practices and everything else. But ultimately, you know, it took everything from me, and I ended up homeless on the streets in Los Angeles.
Were you in contact with your family during this time?
So I was in contact with my, yes, I was in contact with my brother and my sister and my dad. You know, but I still had not come out to my dad. I had not told my dad my story. The only people who knew were my brother and sister, and they were open and accepting. But when I went to the streets, I essentially lost contact with my brother and my sister. And during that 2-year time, you know, one of my regrets is my sister got married, and I'm not in those photographs, right, for the wedding. My brother and sister also lived in Los Angeles at the time. And I remember sitting in the park in Los Angeles, and I was probably a block away from that wedding, just sitting outside. And the key point, not a key point, but an important point to make though with my homelessness is, and this all ties in with mental health and addiction, is yes, it was a struggle for me with my identity, but I also most definitely struggled with anxiety. I think that I had been raised to have an attachment to perfection, and that was disabling to me. When I was on the streets, for the most part, even though I would find drugs and get high, I would say a good 80% of my 2 years on the streets was actually fairly sober for me. And if someone asked me why I stayed on the streets, it was because I wasn't really sure that I wanted to do what was required to live. I most definitely could have reached out to someone and slept on their couch.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, if someone was going to help me, there's that agreement that fine, sleep on my couch, but show me that you're going to dig in and get yourself squared away in your life. And my anxiety was crippling, and I didn't want to do that. I think it came to a head when one day I had fallen asleep in a park it was adjacent to Beverly Hills actually. And I had fallen asleep, and I got up and I was walking to where I had hid my backpack, and a policeman followed me. And he put on gloves and searched my backpack, and we spoke for a little bit. And I think that I was an anomaly for him, because he couldn't understand why I presented of sane mind, why in that moment I wasn't under the influence. There didn't appear to be any reason that I couldn't function in society, having a job, etc. And he couldn't figure it out. And I didn't really give him the answers that he was looking for. And he just said to me, he said, well, I'm going to walk this park every day and I'm going to give you the hardest time if I see you again, because I don't understand why you're on the streets, and you should go get help. And that was a really compassionate moment on his part for me. And that was probably one of the motivations that got me to go to find a shelter and to begin to get my life back together, at least to get off the streets. And after getting off the streets, I did get a job, and I actually moved my way up to be a district manager. And then that company, you know, in like 2009, when everyone was on unemployment because of the economic crash, that I was unemployed again. But during that time of employment, I was never completely free of methamphetamine. Every couple of months, I would still give into it. And it's important to note that, because when I became unemployed in 2010, for about 9 months, although I had found a job and although I had been earning good money, I had resolved nothing with regards to how I felt about myself. Yeah. And when it came time to be unemployed, I had no idea what I wanted to do next. I had no idea who I was. Mm-hmm. You know, oftentimes, as you said, we're prejudged for the career that we have, or the job we hold, or the level of education. And I had never gone to school past high school, and I had no idea what I wanted to do. And because of that, I fell deeper into methamphetamine again. And that was when I went into rehab for a month. Mm-hmm. During that time, I got out of rehab. I stayed clean for about 6 months. And so this is, I'm going to share this part of my story, but this is the part, everyone who uses drugs has their own version of hitting rock bottom. So this next part is my rock bottom. Mm-hmm. So I was so sick of falling victim to methamphetamine, and I gave up. I was on food stamps, and I missed 2 days of food stamps, and so I didn't eat for 2 days. And it's just crazy. So all of a sudden, it was 2 days had passed, and I thought, and I had been sick, and I thought, well, that's okay. I'll just go tomorrow. The next thing I knew.
You had a home at this point, right?
Huh?
At this point, you did have a home. You were.
Yes, I was in a studio.
Okay.
I was alone.
Okay.
And then day 3 passed. And then it was day 5, and I hadn't eaten. And I thought, well, maybe this is the way I go. Maybe this is how I end my life. So I didn't eat for about 30 days. And my apartment manager, who was my friend, comes knocking on the door and just starts screaming when she sees me. I still have a pic of it, which I won't share, but I'm at this point, I think 120 pounds, and I weigh 210 right now.
Wow.
And she's screaming, and I haven't spoken to my dad in a year and a half. And she grabs my phone and she calls 911, and then she calls my dad and tells him he has to come here now. They're taking me to hospital. They don't know if I'm going to make it, because they don't know what's going on with me. And no one knows that I essentially gave up and gave up on life and tried to kill myself, because that's essentially what I did. It was this, I had this idea in my head that I didn't ever want my dad to find out that I had done this to myself. And I was so worn out from the battle with myself that this just seemed like the easier way to go. So I ended up in hospital in Los Angeles, and my dad drove like 12 hours overnight to get there the next morning. And when I saw him walk in, you know, you see this expression on a parent's face. And I just thought, oh God, what have I done? And I remember hearing this voice inside of me that said, you know, that it essentially was, you're not going anywhere because I'm not done with you. And I don't know what that voice was from. That was just my experience. Mm-hmm. So I was on IVs and everything else. And my sister.
What did you go through during those 30 days? Because that's a very long period of time to be in that contemplating sort of a mindset.
It's kind of scary how easy it was to not eat. I mean, I drank water. Rumor has it, and as we all know, dehydration is a painful death.
Yeah.
So I wasn't that far gone, but I didn't eat. And it got very easy to not eat. It wasn't like I was getting out of bed and my depressive state would just knock me in and out of sleep. It was, I don't even know really how to describe it, because I still can't believe that happened to me. You know, I hold on to a picture, and it's a scary looking picture of my dad next to me when I'm in hospital. And it's a terrifying picture. I hold on to it to remind myself, and I hold on to it because part of me is like, no one would believe it happened. Because in some ways, and I don't want to negate from the experience, but in some ways it's absurd to me still. But it's an important point in my life, because that summed up the battle that I was having with myself.
I think you touch on a very important point. The point that I think when you have issues with yourself, it prevents you from finding help, from taking care of you. Don't, I think the first person we take care of is ourselves, right? We feed ourselves, we clothe ourselves, we shelter ourselves. And if you're not in the right mindset, you stop doing those things. You stop taking care of you, and you stop asking for help from people to help you take care of you. So it's like there's two of you, you know, in your head. It's like there's the one that's like doesn't.
Well, I always say, when someone goes to therapy, if you go to therapy, the ultimate job of that therapist, if it's just a session with you, is they're supposed to be the referee between you and yourself. And the other way I describe it is one of those science fiction movies where someone's in a dream and someone else has to go into the dream and get the person out. Because that dream that person is having, which in this instance is our version of our lives and the beliefs that we hold to be true, whether they're actually true or not, is that dream. It's kind of like when someone says the only thing you should truly fear is fear itself, because fear doesn't actually exist. I don't know if you're familiar with Marianne Williamson, but Marianne Williamson would say it's like a big giant thundercloud. You get into the airplane, you take off, and you think, oh my God, what are we going to do? And then you fly through the cloud and you're like, what? And it's just this illusion of fear. But the life that we live can be a really nasty science fiction dream that you can't get yourself out of.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that is absolutely my experience for really the first 32 years of my life.
So I think when you say um, science fiction sort of dreams, I think you mean, I don't know, do you mean limiting beliefs about
Yeah,
yourself?
absolutely. Absolutely. Like, um, let's say a lot of times what we're most afraid of is the unknown. So someone, I mean, I now work I do career coaching, but I work with homeless individuals as well. And I actually, with a group of people, we work with some people who are fleeing domestic violence, for example. And you might say, well, how come this person is always at risk of going back to the abuser? And from the outside in, that might look absurd. It might look ridiculous. But if that's all you've ever known, then a part of how you define yourself to yourself is that that is what you deserve. And that becomes just as much of a truth as the sun rising in the east and setting in the west. It becomes science for you. It's no longer an experience. It is scientific fact, and it's unmoving for you, right? Um, and
Because you start to believe that
yes,
you deserve it
yeah,
in some way, or that's how it's going to be.
exactly. So sometimes when someone has not been raised, for example, religious the way that I've been raised, they can't comprehend that, they can't understand why I was so afraid to come out. But the truths that I were taught were like the stories of Sodom and Gomorrah. I remember being put to bed with a children's version of the towns of Sodom and Gomorrah in the Bible, and the family fleeing and turning to pillars of salt because they looked back at the city. Those were the stories that were taught to me.
Yeah.
Those were taught to me just as much as you should not steal, and um, and those became not just my truths. Those became my scientific facts for what I believe in.
Okay.
And it takes guts to face that and
Yeah.
to question that truth that's taught to you.
Definitely. Definitely. So, if I was going to ask you, coming sort of to what you're doing now, what kind of people should reach out to you? What kind of people do you want to work with? Who can you help, and how do you help them? You know?
So it's interesting that you mentioned the example of you coming across the border from Canada back to Boston,
Yeah.
because you used the example of people deciding who you were based on what you told them you did for a living. And um, the aspect of a career is always has been fascinating to me, because I, here in the United States, you're right, the very first thing we get asked is, what do you do? As if it's just as much a part of you as your ethnicity or any other fundamental part of you of who you are.
Mm-hmm.
But the other piece of that is, it's important to recognize that a job is different from a career, and a career can be many facets of your life. I think that our career can be us as a child. We can be a daughter or a son. We can be a worker. We can be a parent. We can be a citizen. We can be a volunteer. And I think that I want to let everyone know that those are all aspects of your career. So the first thing is to recognize that your value and how you express your strengths and the career you do, don't let it be determined by only the things that you get paid for monetarily.
I
If you're,
completely agree with you.
yeah, if you're a parent, remember that part of your career is being a parent, and the value that you are giving is more than earning revenue for a company. You're now adding value to the human experience, because you're raising a child.
Mhm.
And you may think that that's not of value because you didn't monetarily get paid for it, but it's of incredible value, right? Um, I think that my bread and butter, my focus is anyone who has struggled with addiction um, and has an identity crisis, in which they want to have a meaningful career and they they don't know how, or they think they don't deserve it. Um, and they have all those limiting factors that they've created in their own mind, whether it's their level of education, whether it's not being able to come to terms with their past. And enabling someone to be able to recognize that every single part of your story can be narrated in the and repurposed in the appropriate way to get you to where you want to be. And of course, I feel like you would understand when I say this, that essentially the first step is really talking about why it's okay where you're at now, because the only way that you're going to be able to see a heaven in the future is if you can see it now. And I think that that's the ultimate lesson that we all have for each other.
I think that what you just said is very deep and profound, but it's very simple, but it's very profound. It's to accept, it's like, I think it's about acceptance, because if you can accept the present moment, you can only make it better.
Yeah.
So, um, so I have two kind of questions that
Yeah.
I've been thinking about lately. One is, what does compassion mean to you, and what part of your life would benefit from it at this point?
I think compassion is meeting people where they're at. I think that we always think that we have to jump in and be the hero. At least that's very much an American way.
Mm-hmm.
If we have to jump in and have this solution.
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of times compassion is simply having the courage to be silent and to sit with someone in their moment. Yeah.
Yeah, that is hard for me. I'm very, when it comes to that, I'm very much an American. I you know,
I
I'm
was
also
taught
like,
by
huh?
I was taught by someone. They said something really interesting to me. There's an incredible nonprofit called Empower Work, and they do this texting with people that are in jobs that are struggling.
Yeah,
And we were taught, first of all, our listening skills, and I think that they said it so well. They said we have grown up in a culture that we feel is very transactional. We feel that every single time someone speaks, we have to respond. We think that if an interaction occurs with someone, we must provide them with a solution.
yeah,
And that's not the case. And that's really, really hard for us. We have to just listen. It's hard for me.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It definitely is. My other question, my last question is, um, and I think it might be a relevant one, is what does it mean to be masculine? That,
I always joke at work because I love the people I work with, and I love the clients I work with, and everyone knows who I am and everyone knows my story. And we always
yeah,
joke because I'll do something masculine and I'll be like, I have to find my testosterone wherever it is. I have to find it. I think I think I'm going to say that I'm not going to answer the question as far as what masculine means to me. Or if I am, I'm going to say what I want masculine to be, which
okay,
is to have the courage to be open and authentic, and to have the courage to cry, And um, if there's something I want from masculinity, it is that it can be a very steady, dependable force that is able to be there despite the emotions swirling around us.
Okay. So are you sort of saying that to be masculine means to be courageous?
Yeah, but that's not, I mean, that's not enough to say that, because that would require us to really talk about what courage is. And I think that courage is simply having the courage to be steadfast in the moment, and to be unwavering, and to be dependable, and to always show up.
Okay. Okay. That's yeah, that's hard. That takes a lot of courage to be
Yeah.
dependable and always show up. Um, that's something that I aspire to, and I think it's easy to do it when it's easy. So I'll share with you a little story about me. Um, my dad passed away in late October. He was in a nursing home in Boston, and the reason I crossed the border was to go see him. And I went through. So I basically, so he was in a nursing home from 2016 to this past October, for about 4 years. And the reason I crossed the border was to go see him. I would try to cross the border every 2 or 3 weeks to go see him. And the last year and a half, I was in a really tough place myself, mentally. I got depressed. I lost weight. I was, taking Prozac for like a year, and I stopped going. Right, and I had seen him, a couple of times, just 2 or 3 times before he passed. After this, a year and a half of not going to see him regularly. And when you just said that, that's what touched me, is like, you know, being consistent about, and I feel like some part of me thinks that I let him down, you know, but at the same time, it wasn't so much that I didn't want to go see him. It was just hard for me physically to do that. So, I can cut myself some slack, but I feel like, yeah, what you're talking about in terms of being, I think for me, and I think maybe there's some overlap here. For me, being masculine is about being giving and forgiving. So, um, I feel like, um, and giving is, it can be giving of your time, of whatever. So, anyways, that sort of, I don't know, I got a little emotional when you said that.
It's hard.
Yeah, yeah.
Was your father was he able to recognize you when you came to visit?
Yeah, he could.
Okay.
He was. I mean, some days he was just not with it completely,
Okay.
but let's say 70% of the time he was. He was. Yeah, he would. He would be normal. He would interact with me. Um, he wasn't that old. He passed away when he was 71, but he had strokes. He had a couple of strokes
Yeah.
earlier on in life, and so, and he was a very, to me, he was he was a man,
Yeah.
because he was very giving. And when he was in the nursing home, he was always, if you're not in a good place, he wasn't in a good place. That's why he was in the nursing home. But he
Yeah.
would never complain, or whenever you went to see him, he was always asking about how you were and how your life is. And he wasn't like, oh, the food sucks here or this or that. He was just like, what's going on with you? So he was giving of the only thing he had at that point, which was his
Right.
attention. So, um, Okay. Is there any sort of concluding words you want to say to just sort of wrap up
I
this?
just enjoyed our conversation this morning. Thank you.
Thank
Um,
you. Thank you. Yeah.
I I've never done this before, and I was preparing myself this morning to make sure that I was completely open and honest in my story. And thank you for your questions.
Thank you for being honest and for putting out all your feelings and your life story. It's it's hard. It's hard talking about
Yeah,
how you've been weak and like when for me to say it, to be on camera and put this out in the world to say, I was depressed and I was taking Prozac or whatever. And I feel like this is the kind of thing that when we initially started, you say, I'm going to say everything. I think that's
yeah,
what we need to talk about is everyone, you see these figures on TV who are like, motivational speakers and thinkers and they never talk about the shit they've gone through or,
well, I think that in fact, I think that term motivational speaking really bothers me because um, it it gives the message as if I'm going to go get motivated, so I'm going to come listen to you right now. And it's such a ridiculous idea if you think about it, because motivation is absolutely internal, as we all know, and you have to determine your own motivation. And a lot of times when you're in a protected room listening to a motivational speaker, you become convinced that all of these wonderful things can come true, and they can. But you exit the room and you remember all of a sudden that the world is spinning with great inertia in the very opposite direction from what you realized in that moment in that protected motivational room.
so. I think
And
this is a great thing you bring up, and I'm really interested to hear what if you had to re-envision what the future of quote unquote motivational speaking, okay, or something that, because I think there's a need there for people to feel inspired, right? So
I
so
think that,
if you were to do it, if you were in
yeah.
a room with some people, where would you take them?
um,
You have 200 people
yeah,
sitting in front of you, and you want to inspire them to be better, to
yeah.
follow their dreams, to feel like they're worth it, to go out and do what they want to do. How do you
We,
envision that?
I think a lot of times, um, at least the American way, is to be taught that we go out into life and we take life by the horns and we take control of it. And then, forget my language, but shit happens because life doesn't get taken control of and things happen.
Yeah.
And you hear that phrase, oh well, it's either partly sunny or partly cloudy, it's up to you. Or you either think you can or you think you can't. Whatever you choose to believe is the truth. And you can sit there and you can go, okay, so I guess my true power is being a co-pilot. That sucks. And it's not about what happens, it's about your response to it. And um, I think that if I was to do motivational speaking and I had a group of people in front of me, I would first of all say that the only way, I would say to them, if you think that in this 45 minutes of speaking to you, that your issues will be resolved and your life will forever be course corrected, please go to the back and get your refund because you're wasting your time.
Yeah.
The truth is, if you decide to listen to me, when you leave these doors, in many, many, many moments to come, you will be asked and forced to drop to your knees because you will have to give up any thinking you previously had. And that's going to drop you to your knees. And if it was motivational speaking, I think that I would call it a course correction in mindset and perception. It would be, you do have the authority to write the story, but you have to course correct your mindset. If you do not do that, you will risk missing the miracle before you. So as an example, let's say that you have a couple and they have a teenage daughter, and it's a religious family, and she's 16 and she gets pregnant. And in that moment, there are multiple ways that the daughter and the father and the mother can evaluate that scenario. And if you're not careful, you run the risk of missing the fact that the child being born, no matter the experience, no matter the circumstance, is a miracle. And if you're not careful, you'll miss it. And you in that moment can choose to take what life presented and to write whatever story you want from it. And it would be a practice of appropriate mindset.
Yes, to recenter.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you, Kurt.
Thank you.